The empath doesn't return to prove a point, they return transformed, grounded, and so powerful that explanations are no longer necessary. For a long time, the empath moved through life being misunderstood. In a culture that often celebrates dominance, speed, and loud confidence, the empath's calm presence and thoughtful silence were frequently mistaken for hesitation or insecurity. People assumed that because the empath didn't rush to speak, didn't fight for attention, or didn't assert themselves aggressively, they lacked strength. But what most people failed to recognize was that the empath was never absent from the moment. They were absorbing it. They were studying human behavior, reading emotional undercurrents, and learning how people reveal their true intentions not through words, but through patterns. Silence, for the empath, was never empty. It was full of awareness. While others were busy reacting, the empath was understanding. While others were trying to control outcomes, the empath was learning what truly drives people. This kind of observation builds a depth of insight that cannot be rushed or forced. It develops over years of listening, feeling, and reflecting. In American society, where quick responses are often rewarded more than thoughtful ones, this quiet development goes unnoticed. Yet it is precisely this unseen preparation that later becomes the empath's greatest advantage. Emotional depth is often treated as a liability in a results-driven culture. Being sensitive is labeled as being too much, and feeling deeply is mistaken for fragility. Many empaths grew up learning to downplay their emotions just to fit in, to survive workplaces, relationships, and social environments that rewarded emotional toughness over emotional intelligence. But that depth was not a weakness. It was an internal training ground. Every emotional experience, especially the painful ones, expanded the empath's capacity for resilience. They learned how to sit with discomfort, how to endure emotional pressure, and how to recover without becoming hardened or cruel. Resilience for the empath didn't look like constant forward motion. It looked like endurance. It looked like staying present through disappointment, betrayal, and rejection without losing compassion or integrity. Over time, this built a form of strength that isn't flashy but is incredibly stable. The empath learned that emotions rise and fall, that pain passes, and that reacting impulsively often causes more damage than waiting and responding with intention. This ability to regulate internal states becomes a powerful form of self-mastery, especially in high-pressure environments common across American professional and personal life. Observation also taught the empath discernment. By watching how people behave under stress, success, and conflict, the empath developed an intuitive understanding of character. They noticed who only shows up when things are easy, who disappears when accountability is required, and who uses kindness as a tool for manipulation. These lessons often came at a cost. Many empaths were taken advantage of early in life because they gave people the benefit of the doubt. But each experience sharpened their awareness. Over time, trust became more selective, not more cynical. The empath learned the difference between being open-hearted and being unprotected. This preparation period was rarely intentional. Most empaths didn't choose to grow this way. Life demanded it. They were placed in environments where they had to be emotionally strong because no one else was. They became the listener, the mediator, the emotional anchor in families, friendships, and workplaces. In American culture, this role is often undervalued because it doesn't come with titles or recognition. Yet it develops leadership qualities at the deepest level. The empath learns responsibility, emotional regulation, and the ability to remain composed when others lose control. Internal development happens quietly, which is why it's often invisible to the outside world. while others were building resumes, personal brands, or outward success. The empath was building something harder to measure but far more enduring: emotional intelligence. They were learning how to read rooms, manage conflict, and understand motivations. They were learning patience in a society that demands instant gratification. This slow, internal growth doesn't make headlines, but it creates a foundation that doesn't collapse under pressure. Self mastery is perhaps the most underestimated outcome of this quiet preparation. Over time, the empath learned how to separate their emotions from their identity. Feeling deeply no longer meant being controlled by feelings. Instead, emotions became information. This shift is critical. It allows the empath to stay calm in situations that overwhelm others. It allows them to make decisions rooted in clarity rather than fear or anger. In a high stakes, fast moving culture like the United States, this ability is rare and deeply valuable. The empath's preparation also involved learning when not to act. In a society that glorifies constant action, restraint is often misunderstood. But restraint is power. The empath learned that not every battle requires a response, not every opinion deserves engagement, and not every provocation is worth energy. This discipline conserves emotional resources and prevents burnout. Over time, it creates a sense of internal stability that others can feel even if they don't understand it. What looked like passivity from the outside was actually calibration. The empath was aligning values, strengthening intuition, and refining judgment. They were learning who they are when no one is watching and what they stand for when it's inconvenient. This inner alignment is what allows a person to move with confidence later in life. When the empath finally steps forward, their actions are deliberate because they are grounded in a deeply understood sense of self. Many Americans resonate with comeback stories because they reflect the idea of reinvention, a core part of the national identity. The empath's journey fits this narrative perfectly. The years of quiet struggle, emotional labor, and internal growth were not detours, they were the training ground. When the empath eventually asserts themselves, sets boundaries, or steps into leadership, it may seem sudden to others. But nothing about it is accidental. It is the result of years spent developing strength in places no one thought to look. This is why the empath's return carries weight. It's not fueled by ego or the need to prove something. It's fueled by self-awareness and emotional discipline. The empath doesn't rise by overpowering others, but by standing firmly in who they are. Their calm becomes authority. Their presence becomes grounding. Their words carry impact because they are chosen carefully, not thrown carelessly. Quiet strength was never weakness. It was strength being built in private. It was preparation happening beneath the surface, away from applause and validation. And when that strength finally becomes visible, it's not explosive, it's unshakable. For much of the empath's life, giving felt natural, offering understanding, patience, emotional availability, and support wasn't a strategy, it was instinct. The empath noticed when others were hurting, sensed emotional shifts in a room, and stepped in without being asked. In a society that often equates value with productivity and usefulness, this ability made the empath indispensable but also vulnerable. People grew comfortable receiving without considering the cost. Over time, the empath became the one who always adjusted, always forgave, always carried more than their share. What the empath didn't realize at first was that generosity without limits slowly turns into self-erasure. In workplaces, relationships, and families, the empath often became the emotional problem solver, the peacekeeper, the one expected to absorb tension so others didn't have to. This role is rarely acknowledged or rewarded. especially in American culture where emotional labor is invisible. Instead of appreciation, the empath often received higher expectations and less respect. Their kindness was mistaken for availability, and their patience was mistaken for permission. The turning point came when exhaustion replaced fulfillment. Burnout crept in quietly through resentment, numbness, or the feeling of being emotionally drained even after rest. The empath began to recognize a painful truth. Constantly being there for everyone else was costing them their own well being. This realization wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden confrontation or a bold declaration. It was a slow awakening to the fact that something had to change or they would continue disappearing in service of others' comfort. Boundaries initially felt unnatural. Saying no triggered guilt. Pulling back felt selfish. The empath had been conditioned to believe that love and worth were proven through sacrifice. In American society, where selflessness is often praised but self protection is quietly judged, this internal conflict runs deep. But with time and reflection, the empath began to understand that boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They don't block connection, they protect it. As boundaries formed, something powerful happened. The empath's energy stopped leaking into places where it was unappreciated. Emotional resources were no longer spent managing other people's chaos. This created space for clarity, creativity, and self respect. The empath began choosing where to invest rather than reacting to every demand. This shift didn't make them colder, it made them more intentional. People around the empath noticed the change often before the empath fully did. Some respected it, others resisted it. Those who benefited from unlimited access pushed back, using guilt, confusion, or emotional pressure to restore the old dynamic. This resistance was revealing. It showed the empath who valued them as a person and who valued them as a resource. This awareness was painful but liberating. It marked the moment the empath stopped confusing loyalty with self betrayal. Boundaries also brought discernment. The empath learned that not everyone deserves the same level of access. Emotional intimacy became something earned, not freely given. This didn't diminish empathy, it strengthened it. By no longer being overwhelmed, the empath could show up more fully and authentically for the people who truly mattered. Quality replaced quantity. Depth replaced depletion. In professional environments, this shift was especially transformative. The empath stopped over functioning to compensate for others. They stopped taking responsibility for problems they didn't create. They began advocating for themselves, their time, and their contributions. In a competitive, fast paced American work culture, this change often led to increased respect. Colleagues who once overlooked the empath began to see their value more clearly when access was no longer automatic. Internally, boundaries restored a sense of control. The empath no longer felt at the mercy of external demands or emotional crises. Decision making became calmer and more grounded. The constant background anxiety of disappointing others faded. In its place came confidence, the quiet kind that doesn't need approval to exist. This confidence wasn't loud or aggressive. It was steady, rooted in self-trust. The most important shift was understanding that boundaries are an act of self-respect, not rejection. They communicate standards. They signal that the empath values their own emotional health as much as they value others. This realization transforms sensitivity into strength. Empathy stopped being a liability and became a skill, one that could be used wisely rather than endlessly. This turning point is what makes the empath's comeback possible. Without boundaries, sensitivity leads to burnout. With boundaries, it leads to leadership, influence, and resilience. The empath doesn't lose compassion, they reclaim direction. And from that place, Their rise becomes not only possible, but sustainable. For much of the empath's life, clarity felt out of reach. Their mind was often crowded with other people's emotions, expectations, and unspoken needs. They could sense when something was off, when tension was building, or when someone wasn't being honest, yet they often doubted their own perception. In a culture that encourages constant input, opinions, advice, social pressure, and comparison, the empath learned to look outward for validation instead of inward for truth. This created inner conflict. They felt deeply, but they questioned whether their feelings were justified. Over time, the cost of this self doubt became evident. Decisions were delayed, opportunities were missed, relationships lingered longer than they should have. The empath tried to see the best in everyone, even when evidence suggested otherwise. In American society, where optimism and second chances are celebrated, this tendency was reinforced. But optimism without discernment leads to confusion. The empath began to realize that chaos wasn't coming from their sensitivity, it was coming from ignoring their inner signals. The shift toward clarity began the moment the empath chose self respect over approval. This choice didn't come from confidence, it came from exhaustion. They were tired of explaining themselves, tired of being misunderstood, tired of carrying emotional weight that wasn't theirs. For the first time, they paused long enough to ask a simple but powerful question. What do I actually want? That question cut through years of noise. Clarity emerged when the empath stopped negotiating their instincts. Instead of dismissing discomfort, they paid attention to it. Instead of overanalyzing others' behavior, they examined how situations made them feel. This internal focus brought relief. The empath began to trust that their emotional responses were not overreactions, but information. In a fast-paced, outcome-driven culture, learning to slow down and listen inwardly became a radical act. As clarity strengthened, chaos lost its grip. The empath no longer felt obligated to respond to every emotional pull. They stopped absorbing stress that didn't belong to them. Situations that once felt overwhelming became manageable because the empath could now separate their responsibility from others. This shift created emotional order where there was once confusion. Decisions became simpler, not because life became easier, but because the empath knew where they stood. In relationships, this clarity was transformative. The empath stopped chasing potential and started responding to reality. They no longer justified mistreatment with empathy or patience. They recognized that understanding someone's pain doesn't require enduring it. This distinction changed everything. The empath could still care deeply, but they no longer sacrificed peace to maintain connection. This balance brought stability instead of emotional turbulence. In professional life, clarity sharpened focus. The empath identified environments that drained them versus those that aligned with their values. They stopped trying to fit into systems that demanded emotional suppression or constant overextension. Instead, they sought roles where emotional intelligence was an asset, not a weakness. In American work culture, this shift often leads to more meaningful success rather than performative achievement. The internal chaos that once defined the empath's experience gradually gave way to confidence. Not the loud kind, but the grounded kind that comes from knowing oneself. This confidence didn't rely on constant reassurance or external praise. It came from consistency between inner values and outer actions. The empath's life began to feel coherent rather than reactive. Clarity also brought peace with uncertainty. The empath learned that not having all the answers didn't mean being lost. They trusted their ability to adapt, observe, and respond thoughtfully. This trust reduced anxiety and increased resilience. When challenges arose, the empath no longer spiraled into self-doubt. They assessed, adjusted, and moved forward with intention. Choosing self-respect didn't isolate the empath, it refined their world. Fewer relationships, but stronger ones. Fewer commitments, but more meaningful impact. The noise faded, and in its place came direction. This clarity is what allows the empath to move forward with confidence, no longer pulled in every direction, but aligned with who they are and where they're going. From an early age, the empath developed an unusual sensitivity to people. They noticed shifts in tone, subtle changes in body language, and emotional undercurrents others overlooked. At first, this awareness felt overwhelming rather than empowering. The empath absorbed moods, tensions, and unspoken expectations without understanding why. In a culture that prioritizes logic, efficiency, and visible results, this intuitive awareness was rarely acknowledged as a skill. It was dismissed as being too sensitive or overthinking, leaving the empath unsure of how to use what they naturally understood. Over time, experience transformed sensitivity into insight. The empath learned that people often reveal more through behavior than through words. They recognized patterns, how insecurity disguises itself as arrogance, how fear shows up as control, how unhealed wounds shape decision making. This understanding didn't come from theory, it came from lived experience. By observing relationships, workplaces, and social dynamics, the empath gained a deep awareness of human motivation. This awareness became a form of intelligence, one rooted in perception rather than performance. In American society, leadership is often associated with assertiveness and confidence, but the empath's strength lies elsewhere. Their power comes from understanding what moves people, what shuts them down, and what inspires them. This makes the empath exceptionally effective in roles that require influence rather than force. They know when to speak, when to listen, and how to communicate in ways that resonate emotionally. This skill allows them to navigate complex situations with a level of nuance others struggle to reach. Trusting this awareness was the turning point. For years, the empath second guessed their instincts, especially when others dismissed their perceptions. But repeated experiences confirmed a pattern. Their intuition was rarely wrong. The more they trusted it, the more effective they became. Decision making improved. Conflicts were handled with foresight instead of reaction. The empath stopped needing external validation to confirm what they already sensed. This awareness also brought strategic thinking. Understanding people allowed the empath to anticipate reactions, manage dynamics, and choose approaches that minimized resistance. Instead of confronting problems head on, they learned when to step back, when to redirect energy, and when to disengage entirely. In fast-paced, competitive American environments, this ability to read situations before acting became a significant advantage. The empath's emotional intelligence also reshaped their relationships. They became selective not because they were distant, but because they recognized patterns early. Red flags were no longer ignored. Compatibility was evaluated realistically, not idealistically. This reduced emotional turmoil and increased stability. Relationships became partnerships rather than emotional responsibilities. In professional settings, this awareness translated into influence. The empath understood team dynamics, recognized unspoken tensions, and addressed issues before they escalated. They could motivate without intimidation and lead without dominating. As organizations increasingly value emotional intelligence, the empath's natural abilities aligned with modern leadership demands. What was once overlooked became indispensable. Understanding people also helped the empath understand themselves. They recognized their limits, triggers, and needs with the same clarity they applied to others. This self-awareness prevented burnout and fostered balance. The empath learned that awareness without boundaries leads to exhaustion, but awareness with discipline leads to power. This is where sensitivity becomes strength. When guided by trust and intention, the empath's awareness is not a burden, but a tool. It allows them to move through the world with insight, precision, and influence. What once felt like emotional overload becomes a refined skill set, positioning the empath not on the margins, but at the center of meaningful impact. For most of the empath's life, strength was measured against the wrong standard. They watched as louder voices commanded attention, as aggressive personalities dominated rooms, and as confidence was confused with certainty. In comparison, the empath's calm demeanor and reflective nature seemed invisible. They were rarely the first to speak, rarely the one seeking recognition, and rarely the one announcing their intentions. In a culture that rewards visibility and self-promotion, this absence of noise was mistaken for a lack of ambition or drive. What others failed to notice was that the empath was always becoming. Growth for them happened internally through reflection, discipline, and emotional refinement. They were learning restraint in moments that demanded reaction. They were choosing composure when provocation would have been easier. This kind of growth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek validation. It builds quietly, layer by layer, until it becomes unshakable. When the empath's comeback begins, it surprises people not because it is sudden, but because it was never advertised. There were no declarations of change, no public rebranding, no need to explain the journey. The empath didn't need to convince anyone. Their transformation was evident in how they carried themselves, how they spoke with intention, and how they no longer chased acceptance. Their presence alone communicated stability. This embodied strength shifts how others respond. Conversations change. Boundaries are respected without being explained. The empath no longer needs to assert authority, it is felt. In professional spaces, their calm becomes grounding. In personal relationships, their consistency creates trust. People sense that this is someone who knows themselves, someone who cannot be easily manipulated or swayed. American culture often celebrates dramatic turnarounds, public victories, and loud declarations of success. But the empath's comeback challenges that narrative. It proves that transformation doesn't need to be performative to be real. True change is reflected in behavior, not announcements. It's seen in choices made under pressure, in standards upheld when no one is watching, and in the ability to walk away without needing the last word. The empath's embodied strength also ends the need for validation. They stop explaining their boundaries, justifying their growth, or seeking permission to evolve. This independence from external approval creates freedom. Decisions are made based on alignment rather than reaction. Life becomes less about proving worth and more about living it. People who once underestimated the empath often struggle to understand this shift. They remember the old version, the accommodating one, the endlessly patient one. But that version no longer exists, not because the empath became hardened, but because they became whole. Compassion remains, but it is no longer self-sacrificing. Sensitivity remains, but it is grounded in self-respect. The power of this kind of comeback lies in its sustainability. It is not fueled by anger or the need to be seen. It is fueled by discipline, self-awareness, and inner alignment. The empath doesn't burn bright and burn out. They move steadily with purpose and clarity. Their progress may be quiet, but it is consistent. In the end, the empath's rise doesn't need an announcement because it speaks for itself. Their calm becomes their signature. Their presence becomes their proof. And in a world obsessed with noise, This quiet embodiment of strength is what makes their comeback impossible to ignore.